We're going to have a great discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. But Brian, I know that you would like to introduce this, so thank you very much.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you for the opportunity. So again, good evening, everybody. Before a few of my colleagues begin tonight's update in partnership with the Board of Education about where we are with our long-range planning work in our district, I do want to just take a brief moment to help ground us with some shared understanding, hopefully, regarding present reality as well as future experiences. Since I've been a part of this incredible school system, I've tried my best to continue to communicate outwards and inwards that we are one of the strongest districts in the nation. I stand by that today. Our schools are high performing. They're also incredibly vibrant, as I shared with you in my remarks earlier. And I understand why our community is so deeply vested, both staff, parents, students, and not just maintaining. I don't hear a sense of just wanting to maintain things how they are, but be at the table in partnership around how we evolve to ensure that vibrancy continues to exist well into our future. But I also have shared many, many times since I've been here is that our district is experiencing a decline in our student enrollment. It is not a sudden phenomenon. This is an issue that is affecting school districts across the country, and it is one that has been apparent in our district for actually several years. And the people in our community are asking, and rightfully so, why is this a problem? And why is our district doing all of this right now? And the answer is, and I don't want to say this, I do not say this to indict any person or district team in the past, but this has been a problem that has gone unaddressed in PSD for several years, and it is only being addressed now. And I'm grateful to be a part of that in partnership with this community and the governance team. And I know it's been messy. We are not the only school district that is consolidating schools, changing school boundaries, and evaluating educational program placements. This is a tough reality for many districts across our state and across our nation, especially as birth rates continue to decline. If we do not continue to do this work, if we do nothing, we will put our entire school district's long-term viability in jeopardy. We will put at risk our mission and reason for being. Ensuring all of our schools have counselors and social workers and music teachers and art teachers and physical education teachers is a priority to the system, and it should maintain a priority, and we need to figure out a way to scale our budget to ensure that that promise continues to persist, that that vibrancy continues to persist well into the future. We also must take a hard look at the realities of ensuring that our plumbers and HVAC technicians are not driving all over the district to continue to fix schools that we're no longer getting a return on that investment. We must think thoughtfully about the limited staff and human resources we have and use their time, their energy, and their talent wisely. It would be, quite frankly, in my opinion, a dereliction of our duty, and one I can't stand for, to do nothing. That our team can't stand for. How we go about doing this, I'm incredibly open to being a part of a different path forward. I am, as the superintendent of schools, not married to any one individual outcome. I simply want, like all of you, for our schools and this school system to be vibrant, not just today, but well into its future. So let's do this hard work together. You're going to hear more tonight about the roles of the PSD Facilities Planning Steering Committee, our district staff, and our Board of Education in just a few minutes. Collectively, I believe that we are going to continue to be courageous and address the challenges that are in front of us in a proactive way, but also in difficult ways. Today, rather than kick the can down the road to the future for other people to deal with this problem and suffer greater consequences in the future. We need to come together. I have a part in that. I come here tonight and every day there forward with a humble heart, recognizing that mistakes have been made in the past that I apologize and take ownership for. But I also recognize that I have a responsibility to be a part of the solution in partnership with this community and this board moving forward. We all want our children and our young adults to be happy and to be prepared for the real world. We want them to have rigorous academic experiences and opportunities to discover their passions. We exist for our students. That's not going to change, and I'm looking forward to being a part of this with all of you. With that being said, I want to introduce our Chief of Staff, Ms. Lauren Hooten, and our Chief Information Officer, Ms. Madeline Noblet, to begin our presentation. I want to thank everybody, as well, always, for allowing me that time to share this important context. So thank you.
All right, good evening, everyone. We are here to provide just a quick update on the Facilities Planning Steering Committee as it is coming together, and then we'll turn the conversation over to the board for your discussion of guiding principles to move that committee's work forward. So starting with just a high-level overview of what we're looking at this point for the purpose of the Facilities Planning Steering Committee, this group is really being established to support the district's long-range planning efforts as we move this forward. We're asking this group to evaluate data and engage very thoroughly with the community to develop 2 to 3 scenarios for change that address the challenges that Superintendent Kingsley just articulated. Some of those scenarios may include things like addressing the empty seats that are in our schools that may require consolidation. This is also looking at things like how we're using our buildings and where we should be investing our capital dollars as we move forward, and things like educational program placement as well. I want to reiterate what Superintendent Kingsley also just said. The committee is starting with a blank slate. There is no proposal on the table that needs to be moved forward. They have the freedom to develop, and we are encouraging creative thinking in this process. So we anticipate that the committee will provide a recommendation directly to the Board of Education regarding educational program placement. So that is things like the placement of our alternative schools, as well as a recommendation regarding the modification of school attendance areas, including the potential consolidation of schools as well. This work will be facilitated by Colorado State University's Institute for the Built Environment, or IBE, and they are already actively working and planning for the steering committee to kick off here in the next week or so.
All right. In line with our community's desire for transparency throughout this process, which we want to honor as often and as much as we can, we want to provide insight into how the committee was selected. So as we shared in a communication that went out on Friday, we put out an application to the community, as one of our members of the community who spoke earlier indicated, and shared that out from December 18th until January 3rd. During that period of time, we had 76 people who had applied, and those are for positions to represent staff in our district, parents and guardians, as well as community members at large who do not currently have students within our system. When we started as a team, a group who were evaluating all of the applications, and we used a rubric to be able to do that and go through each of the questions, we noticed that there was underrepresentation from some of the groups across the district. In particular, we did not see as many of our licensed colleagues and some of our, as well as our classified colleagues. And knowing that this process is incredibly arduous, it is complex, it has many ripple effects, and is important to all of us, as a group evaluating those applications and as a cabinet team said, we need to go back out and look for additional applicants so that we can have the best representation possible as we move through this work. That said, we want to bear in mind what I think some folks in the room mentioned earlier. It is a significant commitment, and so we don't overlook that in the least. The folks who have ultimately been selected to serve on this committee they are volunteers first and foremost, and we are so incredibly thankful for their willingness to commit the time, the energy, and quite frankly, the difficulty that it is to represent decisions that are ahead. In that second round of applications, we had 31 additional people apply. And what we attempted to do is take a look, again, through assessment using that rubric to have the best representation across all of our different feeders, across all of our different schools, to have representation across our 3 employee association groups, to make sure that we had representation for our students with disabilities, that we have have those who represent different educational programs within the district. So trying to have the most dynamic group with the broadest range of experiences as possible. We also took a look at and are very excited for what we believe are diverse experiences and areas of expertise across all of those individuals. So from deep planning experience in different industries within the community to those who have experience assessing large data sets and deriving meaning from those and making decisions, to those who have done work with to support people who belong to marginalized populations and everything in between. We feel like we have a really strong, creative, talented group that are going to work with the Institute for the Built Environment to do this and move it forward. We have, as our communication on Friday indicated, we've notified those who have been selected. And for anyone in our community who has not already had a chance to see who is serving on the committee, on the PSD website, you can go to either the large image and section at the top titled Long Range Planning, or navigate to that web section. And we have a web page dedicated to the committee itself, where people can see, are they a licensed staff member, classified, a parent, guardian, community at large, and then what schools or area they represent, so that you can go and see the composition for yourself as well.
So our committee composition at this point consists of 37 members. 34 of those were selected through the application process that Madeline just described. 18 of them are staff members. We have 6 licensed representatives, 5 classified, and 7 administrative. We also have 14 parents and guardians, 2 from each of our feeder systems. We have 6 feeders in the district. We also created effectively a 7th feeder with our alternative programs and our transitions program, so we could ensure representation there. We have 2 community representatives who are folks without students currently in PSD schools. And as Madeline mentioned, we do have some seats that are unfilled. We did not receive applications for certain seats on the committee, so those will remain vacant at this time. And then each of our employee associations, PACE, ACE, and PEA, have appointed a representative to sit on this committee as well. So the group will represent quite a number of our schools across each of our feeders. So you're seeing those listed here. We also have representatives from Polaris, Poudre Community Academy, Centennial, our integrated services program, specifically our transitions pathways. And then, as I mentioned, we have parents as well as staff from each of our feeders, community members without students in our schools, and a representative from the central office as well. So we feel really confident that we have a breadth of schools and perspectives represented in this group.
One of the things that we've heard, not only from our colleagues and community members, but this evening as well, is how do we ensure that this committee hears diverse voices throughout this process, right? And that is always a priority and always a challenge, quite frankly, whether it is this large-scale issue that we're addressing or any at a site, department, or district level. One of the first things we will be doing over the course of March and April is hosting a series of listening sessions. These are open to any member of the community, students, staff, parents, community members, to be able to come and share your concerns, your input, your ideas, values, the things, I think I heard earlier, things that are most important or non-negotiable in terms of what you love most about your school communities and don't want to see change or think are most important to support our students. This is an excellent venue to be able to provide that type of feedback to the facilities planning steering committee so that they can use that feedback as they are developing the 2 to 3 recommendations that will ultimately come to the Board of Education later in the year. One of the sessions on April 4th and will be held at the Future Ready Center at the Mall in Midtown Fort Collins is a session for participants who speak, whose primary languages are Spanish and Arabic. We also have been working with our colleagues in our language, culture, and equity department, as well as student services, to get their ideas and have them work with the Institute for the Built Environment to make sure that there are other steps within this process to ensure that we have and are elevating the voices of those who represent our most marginalized populations, as well as helping provide an understanding to the committee around who are the most marginalized populations within our community so that there's shared understanding of that as this work unfolds. We also, as I indicated earlier and Lauren did as well, have a representative from our integrated services department who will be supporting, who supports the transition programs, who will serve on the steering committee. So in some school districts, integrated services is also referred to as special education. So these are our colleagues and teams that support students with disabilities throughout PSD, and that is an important group and representative to be able to support efforts around inclusion. We will also have staff from our language, culture, and equity department who will attend committee meetings and serve as a resource to the committee as they may have questions throughout their process around, again, who are the most marginalized populations and students within our community, what resources exist currently, where are programs, and to be able to answer questions as they develop the recommendations that will be forthcoming. And the last piece is student voice, as we've said, is critical. And so members of the committee were asked in their applications around their ideas for engaging students throughout this process, students of all ages. And I would say we have a long list of some really creative ideas as a good starting place. And then one of the charges of the committee specifically is to develop a plan for garnering student voice, which could be in digital formats, could be in person, can be a multitude of things throughout this process. So the Institute for the Built Environment will be working with the committee to take those ideas as a starting place and say, let's now build your plan for what that will look like specifically, right? Whether that's going to student advisory committee or it's hosting listening sessions at schools. At this point, we can't say what that is specifically because we have a good place to start with everyone's ideas, but that student engagement plan will be part of the committee's work.
So we also wanted to spend a little time this evening just making very clear the roles and the decision-making process that will be associated with the steering committee's work. So just to articulate this by role, the Facilities Planning Steering Committee is really charged with leading this work. It is their responsibility to evaluate data and information and to come up with the scenarios that they will directly present to the Board of Education. So throughout this process, we anticipate that representatives of that committee will come to these meetings to provide updates on their work for all of our board directors. And then they will ultimately make their direct recommendation to the board at the end of the spring term. Staff and superintendent's role in this process is really by invitation of the committee. We are there to provide a resource to the committee, to provide information to the committee, to help with sort of parsing through all of the information that they'll be synthesizing to come up with the scenarios that they ultimately put in front of the Board of Education. So staff is really there as a resource at the invitation of the committee members. And then the Board of Education is ultimately the decision maker here. So the role of the board is to listen to what the committee brings forward, what our general community brings forward, and then to provide feedback to the committee as they bring their updates over the next several meetings through the course of the spring, and ultimately vote on the recommendation that comes forward at the end of the steering committee's work, which again, we are not anticipating implementing before the 25-26 school year. All right. So at this point, we're going to transition into a discussion of guiding principles. And I'm going to put up some of the discussion questions and statements that we'll be working with this evening, but we're going to kind of do this in a little bit of a different process than we typically have. So we'll start with sort of an overview of these questions and principles, and then we'll actually take one question at a time, and Madeline and I will live scribe as the board has this conversation. So Kristen or Brian, do you want to move us into this section?
Did you want to move into, just talk about our first bullet point, or should I? Okay, I'd love to do that. So yeah, as you can see, our first bullet point here is that we must ensure our district is financially sustainable now and in the future. And what I want to say about that is, right now, every child has nearly every opportunity in this district. We are in a financial position right now where that is not sustainable. That is not going to be the future of PSD if we continue down the path that we are on. So our charge is to ensure that the district is financially sustainable and that children have the opportunities that they have now. That is my value, and I believe that you will hear from the board that that is their values as well. What we're going to do now is we're going to go through the 4 questions, and we're going to state our intentions on creating some of these guidelines. And then we're going to come back to each question, and we're going to narrow down to 2 to 3 bullet points of these are the things that for the board are the values and the non-negotiables, if you will, from the board. So what I'd like to do is we can start on that first question. There'll be some live scribing. For those of you who have noticed that Director Reed is not here, she has had a family emergency out of state, so that is why she is not with us tonight. This work is very important to her as well, and she has given us some input to put in as well. So you may hear some questions that actually Director Reed has sent as well. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We understand that this is going to be extremely difficult work for the committee, for the community, for parents, and for the students. So this is something that we are trying to be very realistic with. It's something that we are trying to be very compassionate about, and something that we are trying to make sure that our main focus is the students. Are the students going to get what they need? And are they going to have the same opportunities that they currently have in PSD? And that will be what we're looking at. So that being said, we're going to start off with that first question of what criteria should be used to evaluate schools for possible consolidation. And we are going to kind of do this in a free form. It's going to be very different than things that you've seen here in our board meetings previously. So we're going to do a little bit of a free form. And so if I have anybody who would like to start it off about what criteria should be used to evaluate schools for possible consolidation. And Jess, I see you.
Thanks. So I think for this one, can we level set just a little bit, because we've talked about specific numbers for schools, and I know that our goal is not to set the hard boundaries, but I also think there's value in kind of knowing where those things come from, like 400 for an elementary school or 700 for a middle school. Why were those the lines in the sand that were obviously not lines now, but there was a reason they were given, right? And I've heard them many times. So
If there's just something that maybe we can ask Lauren or Madeline, or even Brian, if you wanted to jump in, or whoever would like to do that. The whole team's here, so it's tag team, go.
I'm going to go ahead and take that one if you don't mind. So we have been talking about building sizes of 400 for elementary and then 700 at the middle schools. So just a little background to where that came from. A number of years ago, probably 4 years ago now, we convened a group of principals to review student-based budgeting, and that was one of our major efforts that year. And as we did that, the group actually began to, the way we did that work was we created staffing models for various different sizes of schools. And we started with, and I'm going to take the elementary for example, we started with an elementary school at the size of 600. And then what the committee did is they began dropping student enrollment and seeing what the budget implications were. And we did this in real time with a number of principals that were building these staffing plans. And what we found is that an optimal range of between 400 and that 600 is the upper range where it's super efficient. But the 400 range is probably what we saw in the data and the staffing models that were created. As schools dip below that, they had a really hard time maintaining basic services within the building. And so what we had to do was provide additional budget in the form of a size adjustment to do that. And so what we see at the elementary level is that size adjustment really starts to take hold below the 400 level. So there is still a size adjustment at 400, but it's not as large as it gets as you get smaller and smaller. As schools get smaller, that size adjustment goes up almost exponentially to some extent. So that's how we did the elementary. Same concept at the middle school. We started with a middle school of 900, began pulling students out and then rebuilding staffing plans. What does this look like at 800? What does it look like at 700? Again, what we saw there is there was a range between 700 and 900. The 700 is where it really started again falling apart. And we had to start putting more and more money into just basically offering the core services that were in those buildings. So that's a little bit of background as to where it came from. It really is driven by a large number of our principals that did that work. I helped facilitate the work, but the principals were actually the ones that created those plans, determined where inefficiencies lied and how robust those were as you got smaller and smaller.
So I just want to make sure I'm hearing it right and make sure that so our community is hearing that too, is that once we get below that threshold, if you will, of either 700 for middle school and 400 for elementary school, basically what we're doing is, in order to make sure that we have the same services, in order to make sure we have front office staff, in order to make sure we have music education and gym teachers and all of what we consider to be a full school experience, it becomes financially more and more expensive to do that for that.
That's absolutely correct. And what we did is we created a size adjustment to compensate for that as schools got smaller. The problem is that it's costing more and more to adjust for that. And there's a point where it doesn't make sense anymore.
And if I can also assume, please correct me if I'm wrong, but as more schools find themselves in that threshold of being under that 400, we are then having to do that size adjustment in more and more schools.
We are having to provide even more and more additional funding just to keep them whole and operating as at the core.
And, you know, one of the things that I'd like to state as my value is that, to me, making sure that we have music and art and gym and, you know, your counselors and your office managers and your front office staff to keep that building running is a priority of mine. Are there other statements that you'd like to go ahead and make? Let's see, Scott, go for it.
Yes. So on here, I think in terms of criteria that should be used to evaluate schools, we need like a scoring system so it can be shown and demonstrated to everybody in the district that each school was evaluated on the same metric, both for qualitative and quantitative things. On the quantitative side, I'd like to see what the actual savings would be if a particular school was closed. You know, we close an elementary school, it's going to save the district $2 million. We close a middle school, it's going to be X number of dollars, and you see those types of things. I do want to kind of go back a little bit, and maybe we should have had a page for that first question about ensuring our district is financially sustainable now and in the future. I think we need to look everywhere. I think we need to ask each school, and I don't know if this ask has happened, maybe it is or is going to be, but each principal to look, where can I cut costs? There's going to have to be shared sacrifice. I think the administration's going to have to look at cutting costs. I think there's a lot of stuff that we've been doing that we can trim. Obviously, there's huge numbers we're talking about, so it doesn't sound like a lot to cut certain things, but every penny counts, and I think we can really do that. Also, what assets do we have? Last meeting, we talked about selling land to earn money for the district, not earn money, but to get value. That might be something that we look at as we're getting into these pretty tough times. So I would just say let's look at the big picture and not just about consolidating. And that's one last thing. On the 400 and 700, we still want to say we have a blank slate to start with. I think that's good guidance. The thing I like about that and what you were talking about is that the experts, the internal experts, were used to get to that number. And I think we really need to lean on our expertise. We do have a great school district and great leaders Let's lean on our internal experts, principals, long-term staff in the schools, and not just consultants. And that's all I'd say.
Thank you, Scott. One thing I will say is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but everybody has been asked to figure out how to do some cuts, including central office. And that's not something that we want to instruct the steering committee to look at. There need to be, it's already too big looking at boundaries and looking at consolidations, and I think to have them go in and talking about, nutrition and transportation and operations in general and central office and, specifics like that. I think there could be a steering committee for each one. So I think we need to really make sure that the focus stays on the consolidation and on the in particular possible boundary changes and what those might look like. And that's not to say that there won't be adjustments in these other areas. I believe there will be, but that's going to be something different than what this steering committee will be doing. Yes, Kevin.
I do want to respond to that first question. Before I do, sorry, I sound terrible. I'm recovering. I did want to say, first and foremost, a heartfelt thank you to those who applied but didn't join the steering committee, who put themselves out there. That exhibits some bravery. Thank you to those who were selected for the steering committee and for the brave souls that are on that committee and the work that's ahead of them. I do want to thank Superintendent Kingsley and PSD leadership for the hard work that they did in getting the steering committee off the ground. I think it's a huge and very important task, and it was a lot of thought went into it, so I appreciate that. I wanted to say thank you for that. Thank you for the community that showed up tonight and continued to show up and discuss this issue with PSD leadership and talk to board members and give us some insights as to how we should, continue this hard work. Thank you for showing up, and for those that can't be here but wanted to show up, your absence is missed. Thank you for showing up. Please keep showing up. What I want to say about the first guiding principle, though, is that I think, to me at least, conspicuously absent from that guiding principle was how these guiding principles are going to be in furtherance of our district priorities. I think that should be a component in that first question when we're examining what schools for consolidation, et cetera, et cetera. So how are the decisions we make, how are the consolidation efforts going to be in furtherance of literacy, of mental health and belonging, and graduating with options, both on a macro level for each school, but also district-wide. To Scott's point, which I think is an excellent one, what is the true saving of a consolidation of a school? What does that get us in furtherance of those three district priorities? I think that's important. And again, I think to Scott's point, which we've gotten out of the Jeffco exemplar, for what you will, or for best case lessons learned, uniformity is good. It helps the medicine go down. It helps people feel a sense of fairness in this process. But as I've said all along, fairness is not always giving everyone the same thing. It's giving everyone what they need. In order to examine what schools need and what communities need, we need to listen to those communities to determine what it is that those schools actually need. On the off chance that, because we've heard it tonight, that Polaris might have different needs than Iraqi, or that our mountain schools might have a different need and serve a different community, also in furtherance of our district priorities, than schools across town. So I think we need to be mindful that while uniformity is good, we should still allow for flexibility in the process in the guiding principle. And finally, on that same one, is that to not get, and this has resonated with me tonight when we heard a community comment from Ms. Patty Zamora, is not to be hypnotized by the complexity of this, and that sometimes don't let perfect be the enemy of good. We have to start somewhere, and if it has to be small, then so be it. So I want to, and that's a lot for one guiding principle, but I think those are some of the thoughts and reactions that I had when I was thinking about this important work.
Thank you so much. If I can just jump off of, Connor, if I can just jump off of what you just said, what that reminded me of, and I think that's it's so important, is that we want to be a district of with vibrant schools in it, and the key word there is a district, and so there may be the equity, the ability to have some schools have things that in other schools don't. That is going to exist given on what the needs are. And so that's going to have to be a part of this. So your example of the mountain schools, that's a different need than some of our other schools. But we need to be thinking about this as a district, and that, you know, in thinking about our three major principles as a district. So how we hit those, and how we approach it, and the old joke is, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So that's what we're going to do here. Connor, go ahead. Oh, sorry, I didn't.
Just
Jim is awkward having you over here. I'm so sorry.
Just piggybacking off of what Scott said, on the financial piece, on cost savings, Dave, I think it's probably more feasible for us to look at a range of cost savings, not a specific number. It's difficult, but I also wouldn't want to see the committee be anchored into one specific number and going at that. It's there's got to be some bounds to that. And then in consolidating schools, as well as the financial sustainability, is not only the cost savings, but the investment efficiency. So we heard this evening, tonight, about, again, air conditionings in schools. We need to be very good stewards of the finances that we do have, the capital that we do have, and I want to make sure that we're looking at consolidation through the lens of which schools are even possible to be invested in. That plays a large role because the sustainability long-term, I would not want to see a future board in, even 5, 10 years down the road having to deal with some of these same challenges. So that investment efficiency portion, to me, is a very good criteria for consolidation.
Thank you very much, Connor. Jim, did you want to?
First, I just want to thank Dave for your comments. I think we need to get those comments on video because the historical perspective that you give. Now, are they already on it and I just don't know? Awesome. That's awesome. Let's see. I guess I want to start with the story. When I worked at HP, I had a lab manager, and he came to one of our big coffee talks, and he said, I'm also a beekeeper. And he said, sometimes I go out to my bees, and you just know when a hive is buzzing, okay? And then sometimes you look at a hive and go, I don't know, it's not buzzing the way the other one was. And his message was that sometimes our lab feels like it's buzzing and hopping, and sometimes it feels like maybe not so much. And first, I'll preface my comments with, there's not a bad school in PSD. I mean, they're all great schools. But as a director, I have the joy of visiting a lot of different schools in the district. And when I visit schools that are full or almost full, I just get that kind of feeling of this is buzzing and there's an excitement here and a vibrancy that I really enjoy. So I believe that utilization should be a key part of our criteria used to evaluate possible consolidation, not just for the financial reason that Dave discussed, but also just to give our kids that experience of that vibrancy. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jim. Other things that have come to mind? Go ahead, Jim. Yep, go ahead, Jess.
Sorry, since I'm, the only one who hasn't chatted yet. I think some things that come to mind are, one, I think going back to some of the values you stated initially, making sure that all kids continue to have access to things that make our schools buzz, right? Our specials, or maybe that's after school care, right? I'm envisioning more families having access to some of the things that we offer, at least in part at some of our schools, but now maybe students having full access the way other students have. So making it more equitable through this process. I think some other things that come to mind in this piece of the conversation are also making sure that students, still feel connected to their school. So whether that's realistic expectations for boundaries, right? Making sure they still have access in some meaningful way. I think the thing that also comes to mind specifically is for maybe elementary schools, their safety in accessing school. So if they do have to walk to school, making sure that that's a safe route. I mean, I just think about some of my friends go to a school, or my my kids' friends go to school. It's not actually that far from us, but it's on the other side of college, right? If we were to like pull them over to us, that would feel potentially dangerous. So just considering the safety of their pathways to their schools would be very important to me.
Anything else? I actually just want to throw in off of what you had just said, Jess, and combining what you said, Jim, is, you know, a lot of what you say with the belonging, feeling like you belong, and that vibrancy. I think about the extracurriculars that can be offered when you have that full hive, if you will, that everything is buzzing, and you get to have those, you know, the smaller chess clubs, and you get to have all of those things that you might not have with a smaller school. So I feel like that vibrancy is definitely something that we can look towards and see if we can't put that in our criteria as well, making sure our schools are vibrant. Yes, Scott. Oh, wait. Oh, sorry.
I just had one other thing. You mentioned sense of belonging, and it kind of made me think of this. I think it's important to acknowledge, I mean, first and foremost, what's best for the students. And I think there are certain schools in the district that have very unique cultures and learning environments that should be factored in. And I think every school could say, hey, we're a special community, that type of thing, and that's true. But there are certain things that are done in district that are different than any other district I've ever seen. And we really need to honor that and keep what makes PSD special here, and not obliterate it just because of some financial decisions. So I would just keep that in mind as well.
Thank you very much. Yes, ask.
It's more of a probing question. It's not just directed to you, Director Schoenbauer. It's maybe for the whole team. I think what you just said is incredibly important, and I appreciate you understanding the context that asking each individual school, there is a uniqueness in somehow how they tell their story, how they exhibit their way of work. Do you have any collective thoughts, and again, this is for the group, around how to prioritize the uniqueness of one school community over another?
I was actually going to jump in on a similar thought. And I appreciate what you both said, because I think it highlights another point that I was trying to make, probably not as artfully as I'd like. But I think to truly understand the consequences of a consolidation of a certain school, you have to truly understand that school community. And so another thought of this guiding principle is that when, I don't want to use the word chopping block, but if two schools are up for consolidation, we need to truly listen to the teachers and the community of those schools about the unintended consequences and the ripple effect of what that closure could do. Because we can apply all the matrices that we want, all the data that we want, but if we're closing an alt school, and I'm a former alt school teacher, so this is near and dear to my heart, what does that do to our enrollment figures? What does that do to the students who go to that school that's a bastion for those kids that otherwise don't have a place? So there's got to be some way to factor in the uniqueness of the school, to your point, Superintendent Kingsley, while also not making decisions based on a very small school or a very small population of our larger PSD. And I think the best we can do is listen. I think we need to listen, examine the consequences that a closure or consolidation might have for different communities, take that into consideration, and ultimately we're not going to make everyone happy. I mean, that's just the nature of the work that we're in. So, but I think listening to people is a lesson learned, and examining what those consequences could be without having a crystal ball, but at least putting some thought into what that could do for these unique communities.
No, I don't want to cut you off again, but I'm going to, so there you go. Just jumping right back off that, absolutely. I was thinking about this the other day, that if one of the alternatives is close a certain school, if the steering committee could invite representatives from that school to be part of a working group to talk about what are the deeper implications. This is where we're talking about the expertise. We want to bring in experts from the district. This would be an example of that, and have those experts from a potentially affected school come in, talk about the logistical needs, and then also the implications to the students, the staff, the parents, all those different things, and ultimately maybe it would help with the buy-in if a decision ultimately has to be made, to know that, hey, our rep got to have their time in the sun. So I think that would be an important thing to do.
Jim, did you have?
Well, now I kind of forgot what I was going to say. No, this discussion worries me just a little bit, only because when I look at all the different schools, it seems like everyone has something wonderful. I mean, they all do wonderful things across the board, right? But everyone has sort of this niche that they have, right? And I'll never say we shouldn't be listening. Obviously, we have to listen to everything, and the steering committee should be listening to all of that. They're the drivers on this, totally. But my concern maybe is that it's easy to start falling back and say, oh, we shouldn't close that school because they have this going, and we shouldn't close that school because they have that going. And we have some serious problems that we need to deal with. And so I would err on the side of going fast rather than going slow. So that's my input.
Jess?
And to that point, I also feel like some of this work is going to be done after, right? Like when decisions are made, and then there are non-negotiables at schools. Like we've heard that loud and clear, but it's usually not non-negotiable in that building. It's non-negotiable for the community, for the students, for the staff. And so I think it's absolutely imperative that we pull those pieces of non-negotiable into whatever building that students may end up at, whether it's the original building that they're in right now or it's a different building in the future. But in talking to some teachers, like there are teachers ready to collaborate and rebuild, right? Take the best of multiple schools and put it together and make something even better than they could imagine today. Do I still think that they should talk to those schools and make sure they're getting the information? Absolutely. But I think to Jim's point, we're gonna all fall into the trap of like every school is beautiful, and then we will not actually make a decision. And that's a different kind of danger. So.
Go ahead, Brian. Oh,
I had just one more to add. Back in November, we had a report from McKinstry on the condition of our facilities with an estimate of future costs on those. So another criteria that we should definitely have is the health, the age, the anticipated maintenance costs of those buildings. That should be another factor that the steering committee should consider.
I think there was some discussion about a school within a school model before. Does that get us where we need to financially? Or is there some benefit to merging schools for head count, for per pupil count that's like a legal issue as far as if you have two schools in a school, you're still only going to get the per pupil head count per individual school?
So a couple of thoughts. Appreciate the question because I think that gets into not necessarily criterion, but potential solutions that I think we have a collective desire to stay true to a blank slate and be open to all possibilities that come out of the steering committee. A school within a school model could accomplish maximizing the enrollment efficiencies that we're looking for, while also maintaining programmatic offerings that are in demand in the system. So that is a possibility that I would say they should explore. Whether it's a value of the committee should remain up to the committee. I want to be brave for a second and just take a moment to try to synthesize what I've heard the board say so far. And I want us to ground ourselves, if it's okay, in the question that focuses on criteria that should be used to evaluate schools for possible consolidation. And I'm one person synthesizing this in real time, so if I am going to be brave and take a risk here. The feedback's been tremendous. As I categorize in my mind and heart the feedback that I've heard, I hear process-driven suggestions, and I also hear that intermeshed with criterion for the committee to look at when they're looking at the depth and breadth of our system in its entirety. Let me give you an example. Things that I think that are process drivers, more than maybe criterion to evaluate one school over another, is ensuring that the process has a scoring system that looks at qualitative engagement, listening to people who are in the school community, while also looking at the quantitative pieces, whether it's enrollment trends, whether it's the facility utilization. So I think we haven't necessarily dug deep yet on the quantitative aspects. So I want to just invite us to be curious about that, because I think that criterion matters to the steering committee. Again, not to box them in, but to give them some potential posts to be thinking about. I've heard the concept of using this as a means to advance our district priorities. I think that's probably a non-negotiable driver that we should charge the steering committee to always be thinking about. These decisions are in service of that, but that might not be a criterion that we can look at an individual school just yet, because as Jim just eloquently articulated, all our schools are really strong schools. Another piece that I thought was maybe a process driver is, there's a sense of urgency to this work, and don't let perfect get in the way of good. Like, let's take that first step and recognize that that's an important mindset that the committee might want to possess in order to grapple with this in its entirety. Again, I want to just reiterate, just so it's captured. There's two other things that I captured that were more drivers, is taking a look at making sure that we do have touch points. Yes, we'll have listening sessions. Yes, we will have the steering committee engagement sessions that are outlined, but there's going to need to be other touch points to really make sure people understand the consequences, unintended and forecasted consequences of a potential decision that impacts a school. I see that not necessarily as a criterion, but a process. Is that correct? So am I tracking with the group in terms of how I'm synthesizing that? The reason I want to share that is because I've heard a couple of things that I do think fall as criteria. One thing that I heard is really making sure the full breadth of offerings that are in our schools today persist. Music, art, physical education, our counselors, our front office staff, to make sure that we maximize those opportunities and not have to be put in a financial situation with the school where we have to take something like that away and they don't get the holistic experience that our families demand. Another criterion that I heard is to take a deep look at, being good stewards of our finances and prioritizing buildings where we know we're going to get a future enhanced investment on deeper investment in the current reality of those buildings. And I think the McKinstry reports help us with that. I heard us also talk about making sure that we have realistic expectations that boundary adjustments and changes are going to be something that they grapple with, but to do that while being mindful of the age group that we're looking at it and be as reasonable as we can to make sure they're realistic expectations that we don't hurt access. The one thing I think we're tracking, those are potential criterion. I'm not saying they're mine criterion, but those are things that I heard you all say. The last thing that I would say that I haven't heard us say in this space, and I would invite us to grapple in more explicit terms, is what are your thoughts on enrollment? Should we be looking at historic enrollment trends? Should we be looking at future enrollment trends? Should we be looking at a both and? I know we talked in the opening around the potential numbers that Dave articulated, but I didn't hear any sense of how we should be looking at that. And Dave, if I can invite you, if you think about those size adjustments that are like in today's current budget, if you were to put all those things together, what does that surmount to?
From a cost perspective? Yeah, so right now, for all of our schools, the size adjustment is running at about $6.8 million. And a point that I made when we were talking to the community about budget the other day is that is our largest adjustment in student-based budgeting, of which, from my perspective, lends itself to that's not the right priority when we have other things like at-risk, levels of support, GT, where the size adjustment has grown to be the largest dominant factor.
Thank you, Dave. So I would invite I promise to stop talking here, but I would invite the board to share with us as a staff, and really in service of the steering committee, more specific thoughts that you have on enrollment trends, and or if the number that Dave just articulated, the $6.8 million in size adjustments. Now, again, I would share from my perspective as the superintendent, it's impossible to zero that out. Right? We are going to have a fluctuating enrollment today and tomorrow and into the next several years. But as Director Duffy articulated earlier, a threshold and or a range may be something we want to strive for. So I just invite you to talk about those two specific things before we may be interested in going on to another question.
Jim, go for it.
So there's two different demographics reports on the public website, on the PSC website, and I've read them both a couple of times. And they're very clear that they expect our enrollment to drop over time. And even the current enrollment, the statistic I like to share with folks is if you look at our 10th, 11th, 12th grade across PSD, non-charter schools, it's about 2,200 people, okay? 2,200 people per class. All right. If you look at the kindergarten and the first grade, it's about 1,700 people. That's 500 people less in our kindergarten and first grades, each one, than are in our 10, 11, and 12. So you know what's going to happen as this wave rolls through our schools. So for the next 5 years, I expect easily a 10% drop, and I think that's a minimum personally. I think it won't surprise me if it's bigger than that. And yet currently, we have 12 schools with less than 65% utilization. And these numbers are from data that's right there on the PSD website. So this isn't private or anything. So when I give my guideline of be more aggressive, don't be so conservative, I really want us to be bold on this because I'm concerned, and I think it's important that if we back off and say, oh, just a little bit is good enough, I'm concerned that if things go worse than the 10% drop, now we're in an even bigger thing, and we're coming back in 3 years and doing hard things again. So I definitely favor doing what needs to be done now. That's it.
And I'll just follow up with that too, that this is not something that is localized to our community. It's not something that is an agenda on one side or another. You can read Fox News. They just put an article out about this, that 30%, they're expecting a 30% drop across the nation of kids entering kindergarten in public schools. So Fox News is talking about this as well as CNN and NPR. So take your pick as far as what news source you would like. This is something that is happening across the nation because the birth rate is going down. So it's something that we struggle with in particular, probably a little bit more, because we also have the added bonus of ridiculously high prices in housing. So the parents that are coming in are not necessarily coming in with very young children, PK and up. They're coming in fairly established. So they're coming in at middle and high school. So one of the things that you'll see is that the numbers are much lower in elementary schools than they are in middle school and high school. So the 3,000 seats that we have empty in elementary will probably continue to grow larger. Whereas the middle school, high school, it'll probably continue to drop, but probably not at the rate that we are seeing right now unless something happens to our housing situation, which at the moment I don't see happening in the next 5 years. So that's something to keep in mind too, as far as the criteria, knowing that this is not localized. It's a nationwide event, and we may be seeing it slightly more affect us slightly more in the elementary schools than we are in the middle schools.
I'd like to offer a response to that then. And this touches on something that Director Zamora said. And Jim, I agree with you on most of everything of what you said, except I think we need to approach this too, even this discussion, with some humility, in that none of us at this table have a crystal ball. We can read data and we can read trends, but again, I think one of the comments we heard from the community, which I share, is that I don't want to make overly drastic permanent solutions to what could be temporary problems. So I would advocate on that regard to a moderate approach, not a severe, but a moderate. And one criteria I think that we should be looking at, and this is something I think you were talking about, is when we're considering schools for consolidation, what is their proximity to another feeder school, which is something that Jeffco did when they did this important work. They literally looked at the boundary map, which I know I've done, and they said what schools are in proximity to others, where are their enrollment trend declines, and I'll pick on my own school of Olander. That sector of town, that school historically was built when there was a boom in that part of town. And so with all the wisdom of the time is that population would always exist, and it doesn't. And none of us have that information. But to me, selfishly, I don't want Olander to close or consolidate. I'm not speaking as Director Velda, but Parent Havelda in that regard, but I think that concern is shared. So before we make drastic changes, I think we need to think about just the baseline proximity of another school that my kid could go to, that could service as a neighborhood school. So I think that might help, and if we could score that appropriately, that would help. Because if you look at the map, there are clusters of elementary schools within stone's throws of each other. So I think that proximity is also something that should be considered.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Brian.
So thank you for that. I think that kind of affirms the statement earlier that Director Zamora talked about regarding being reasonable around boundaries and distance to not perpetuate lack of access. So I appreciate that. I think one of the things that I would invite us to be curious about, and I'd love a general reaction, because multiple things can be true at the same time. And as I listen to Director Brokish and you, Director Havelda, talk about, we don't know what's happening in the future, but I want to share, and we have a lot of work to do with educating the community. I agree with you that I don't know what's really going to happen in the next 5 years. It might be 10%, it might be higher, it might be lower. I will share since I've been here, the projections have come in at a certain number, and we have an unanticipated, in the last 3 years, surge of people moving into our community at the high school level. This past year was significant. I think it was our seniors. Like, we had 100 more seniors come in. So they're only with us for a year. So it's really strange, that data point. Whether that persists or not, I don't know. But I want us as a community to really ground ourselves that we have about 6,000 empty seats in our buildings today. And if we can potentially, and I'm inviting you to be thinking about this because I do not want to set the charge, but I'm curious if when you think about the size factor adjustments, that $6.8 million represents trying to balance out the effects of the empty seats that exist in those schools. And I'm curious if there is a criterion there that you think that that's something that they should, as a steering committee, prioritize. Because yes, you don't need a crystal ball. That's happening like right today. Like those things are existing. This is what it costs. This is where it's happening. We have all of that information. We know the impact and what it's paying for. We want to make sure that we keep that. But I'm curious if that's a value of this board to have a focus on, yes, we want to try to be as aggressive in solving this problem so we're not here 3 years from now. But I'm wondering if a stepping stone to that is solving the deep problem that we already have in our backyard today. I don't know I would love your reaction and thoughts to that.
Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, I'm in favor of kind of a stepping stone or a staged or different stages kind of process. I think one thing we have to look at on the trends, I would love, this would be something maybe you could do some digging on, is in 2016, what were those same trends, those same demographic models showing for our district? Because that's when we passed the Wellington and Timnath schools, right? We needed to grow because the community was going to grow so much. And here we are 7.5 years later, and it's the exact opposite. And I think that's where we have to have the humility to understand that we don't have that crystal ball. So if we can go on a, different levels so that we're not caught in a situation where we've mothballed a school or sold a building or close something down or demolish something that we may need to bring back online down the way. And I think that's why this is so difficult. But I don't know if that answers your question, but it kind of along those lines.
It does. I think I'm looking for greater direction from the board, and I hope that this is coming across in a genuine way of back and forth, right? It's just, we haven't yet talked about enrollment. And I want us to not necessarily name a number, that's not the intent here, but as we think about, we have projections into the future that we can take a look at, but we also know where those trends exist and how much we're paying to fill that gap today. And I'm curious if that may be a starting place for the steering committee to consider as a place to build off of, not necessarily the end game, right? I'm not looking that there's going to be more work to be done beyond that. But as we're looking at criterion for potential consolidation, I don't know if we have a guiding principle or a value yet from the board around how to look at enrollment, current enrollment, not necessarily what might be the enrollment 5 years from now.
And if I can jump in there, I think we've sort of danced around. And so what I would like to say in all of this great feedback that we've gotten is I feel like we could narrow this down into two right at the moment. And I'm going to throw this out there and y'all yay or nay me. I'm actually going to take McKinstry off of this one because it can be integrated into the question 4. So I feel like McKinstry is extremely important, and that value can be placed in question 4, I believe, of how we do the building. Let me make sure that I have that correct. Okay. So to me, I think that what we danced around was the 400, 700. And to me, what I would like to see as a value is that we aim for that optimal number, which happens to be 400 or 700 for most schools. We understand that there are going to be, there are programs that can't allow that. There are buildings that can't allow that. We understand that, but to me, a strong value is that we head for that optimization so that we can go ahead and not have to adjust for the size factor while still having everybody have what they need for students. So that would be my first value to state. The second one would be we kind of said two things: don't hurt access, and then proximity. And I think those two things are pretty much the same, right? We want to make sure that the proximity that we're talking about is not going to hurt physical access. And then we have to think about access to other things, such as programming, such as ADA access, such as these other things that come up. So to me, the two things that I would suggest would be the values of trying to hit that optimal number, and then the don't hurt access. I'm laying that out for you all to think about as our two criterion for this particular. I said we were going to do all of it and then come back to one, and I lied because I feel like we've gotten to the point where we could probably narrow it down to those two. But what do y'all think? Go ahead, Scott.
The only thing I would say on the 400, 700 is, and this is a nice grenade I'm going to throw out there, what does that mean about class size? Like number of students in each class? Because 400, 700 sounds good as a general rule of thumb, but if that means it's an expectation of 30 kids per class, we all know that's not conducive to great learning. It's, there's different studies as to what that number is, but I don't know if we want to get that specific, but that would be, I think, a pushback on setting a number would be what that interprets, or what that translates to, I should say.
Yeah, go right ahead.
I really appreciate that question on a lot of different levels. I think what resonates with me is what Dave mentioned earlier in terms of where did these numbers come from? They were not arbitrary from the central office given to the schools. They were principle created to optimize their budget so they can offer classes that are not overburdened by class size while also offering the various electives and needs that a school has. So I trust that wholeheartedly. I do want to, and I'm going to say something, not to throw a grenade into the community, but I think it's quite fascinating that what's not well known in our community yet is that our average class size in PSD this school year is 19 students per class. Now, if you're a teacher that's teaching more than 19, you're going to say, like, that's not right. It is right. There are some classes that are much higher than that, so I want to name and affirm so they feel seen, because it's valid. But there are also a lot of classes that are much smaller than 19. And so that is something that we could consider looking at. And I believe that we have to do some due diligence there. I don't want to send a message that we have to solve this financial challenge on the backs of our schools and teachers. There's going to be shared responsibility in how that plays out. But I do believe that the numbers articulated around the 400 and 700 have class sizes that are embedded in that are manageable. Where that doesn't apply are in some of our smaller schools that are maybe considered alternative or have unique programs where class size probably should be a little bit lower. And we need to think about, like, what number should that be? I think the steering committee, knowing that there's teachers and classified and administrators, that would be a great conversation for them to have. But there's definitely potential in what you suggested.
Go ahead, Jess.
So, quick math, 400 students in elementary with 3 tracks at each grade would be 22.6 kids per class. So more than 19, but not the 30 that I think we kind of think about, because my kid's been in some of those classes. Sorry, I'm going to continue though for a second. I like the idea of stating that because, 22 in a class is not bad, right? Especially for elementary. At least not for my kids, not saying that's for everybody's kids. I think I worry a little bit by stating the numbers that this will be interpreted as like, that's the hard goal. I know that our goal is to not say that explicitly, but I think especially for some of those alternative schools that do need smaller class sizes, or even maybe schools that have like special programming within them, if we're saying that they should be hitting 400, but they have a special population that really requires them to be a little under that or have a different option, I understand why we want to put it up there. And I worry that that's going to get so embedded in people's mind that they're going to get stuck there and not start considering that that's just a guiding principle and not a hard line.
Now, I'm wondering, and sorry, Jim. So what I'm wondering is if we were to throw in that optimization. So if we say aim for enrollment optimization, on average, that is 400 for an elementary and 700 for, and knowing that each one is slightly different and has their own unique entities. Jim, go ahead.
My only comment is, if we have a strong expectation that over the next 4 years, enrollment's going to drop by 10%, should we be making it 400 plus 10% and 700 plus 10%? So that in 4 years, we're about right.
Kevin.
Okay, to address your question right on enrollment. I want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly, not conflating the issue of utilization with enrollment, because I think they're separate and distinct, but they're also obviously intertwined. I like Director Broch's idea of, if we have to start somewhere, let's look at schools that have a 60% threshold of utilization, and we can do a range, 60 to 70%. And let's at least start the conversation there, examine what the reasons are for that, and whether those would be appropriate places to start. Is that, I don't want to step on you, but I think, is that a fair summary of where you're going with that?
Yep.
Okay. As far as like a starting point, we got to start somewhere. That's not going to say that these are, and I don't want the schools on that list to start, sweating, but I think that's an appropriate place. We're trying to do a uniform applications, data-driven, which is what I believe Scott was saying. I think that's a good, that might be a helpful starting point.
And I feel like that could be added as sort of, we said 2 to 3, right, Lauren? So that could be 3.
And before we move on, I'm going to request a 5-minute break before we move to the next question, if that's all right.
Understood.
5 minutes, seriously. But.
Understood. Are there other comments, though, on, I mean, I don't want what I have said to be the end-all, be-all. I want, poke, please. This is what we're here for. We're here to discuss this. If these 3 things here do not feel like the 3 main criteria that you feel the steering committee should be using, then please state it now or forever hold your peace.
Can we read the 3?
Oh, yes, some of us can.
Thank you.
So the first one is start a conversation with utilizations around 60 to 70%. The second one is aim for enrollment optimization. On average, that is approximately 400 students in elementary and 700 students in middle, knowing that this does not fit for all schools to minimize size factor. And 3, ensure access, physical access, proximity to other schools, and ADA.
Start conversation is just a little ambiguous to me. These are where we want to start the discussion around consolidation with those schools, right?
I was going to say
Okay,
candidates for
Yeah.
change. Yeah.
what I'm going to propose is that we take a 5-minute break. At the end of all 4 questions, we'll come back and we'll look at all the 2 to 3 highlighted bullet points at the end and make sure that we've got all of our bases covered. All right. So we're going to go into recess at 8:29 on January 23rd, and we'll be back here at, we'll say, what is that, 8:35. We're going to come on back. It is 8:35 p.m. on Tuesday, January 23rd, and we're going to go ahead and start up with just going to recap. We're okay to move on to question 2, and then we'll come back to question 1 and make sure we are feeling good about where we are. Does that sound good to everybody? Thumbs? You're fired. All right. So question.
No, but you asked if we were okay.
Oh yes, yes.
We didn't hit my 440 and 770, but I'm willing to live with it as long as I'm willing to live with it.
And you'll have an opportunity at the end too, Jim. We're going to come back to go through all 4, hit those highlights, and if we're seeing something that we're missing that hasn't come up in the following 3 questions, we will make sure it gets in there. Sound good? All right. So we're going to move on to question 2. How can we expand programming across the district where there are wait lists? So does anybody want to kick this one off? And you know what? I'm going to actually start. I'm going to backtrack just a moment here. I just want to let people know what programs are. So, you know, a lot of times when we talk about programs, people tend to think about maybe a federal subsidy, federal program, Title I, that sort of thing. What I want to make sure people understand on this is when we're talking about programming, we are talking about specialized curriculum or programs that are in particular schools. So for instance, expeditionary learning or core knowledge or IB or the Leader in Me or PBL, project-based learning, the alternative, what we can call the alternative high schools. So those are the programs when we say how can we expand programming across the district where there are wait lists. And we do know that some of these programs do have wait lists, and we know that some may not. And sometimes they have wait lists in the elementary side and not in the high school side, and vice versa. So knowing that, is there anything that we'd like to throw out there as guiding principles for this question? Yes, Jess.
Sorry, I now have candy in my mouth. I think one piece that we aren't quite doing exceptionally well all the time now is like continuity of those programs. You know, IB's kind of all over the district, core is all over the district, and it's not always convenient or even accessible. Like if you went to one of those elementary schools, it may or may not be accessible at a middle school. So kind of considering, is it really accessible for the students who are already in those programs to continue with that learning style, or even folks who want to start out in that learning style, is it accessible? So even maybe, what's the word I'm looking for, sort of, I don't know if I want to charge them with spreading it across the district, but maybe considering if they're going to consolidate, like maybe not continuing to group programs in particular neighborhoods only. I don't know if that's something I want to charge them with specifically. That feels.
Can I restate what I'm
Yeah,
hearing you say
please.
maybe a little differently just to see if we're in alignment? So what I hear you saying is try to maximize program continuity K-12, both in terms of location, but also in terms of the continuity at each of the levels, elementary, middle, and high. Is that fair?
Other things that have come to mind on this?
Kristen?
Yes, go ahead, Connor.
I would say something that's very quantitative is results. All schools are unique. We have good outcomes, relatively speaking, but there are programs that have better outcomes. Those ones who are performing at the highest level should at least be looked at for expansion. I see that in the majority of districts when I think of the district map of where some of these very high-performing schools are at, there's the ability to expand that curriculum to other schools within this process. I think results speak for themselves. And in the community, if we're saying that, you know, 2 schools will be consolidated and this new curriculum will be coming in, there's justifiable pushback to that. I like the way my kids are being taught. I like this curriculum, but you're getting better results from the other schools, so that one should take priority. As far as the concentration of programs, to Jessica's point, and in conjunction with what I just said, looking at the map of schools, we do have some opportunities where we have pure school of choices next to neighborhood schools. The school of choice has a different curriculum and they have a wait list. That says to me that there is great demand in the community for that curriculum. I see that the potential to at least investigate taking both of those schools, changing the curriculum to the one that is performing better, and making sure that there's ample space for all students who want to be in there. I see that, and I'm thinking again, I see that a lot with core knowledge, expeditionary learning, somewhat in IB, and I think that if we keep the top cluster of high-performing programs in there, that gives us enough diversity throughout the district so that people do have options on where their children attend.
I promise this won't be a back and forth every comment because I want to get as many of your ideas out as possible. But I'm grateful that you talked about both curriculum demand in certain pockets of the community while also taking a look at what type of outcomes are we getting. One of the most challenging parts of this situation for this district is we're not looking to circumvent how to deal with accountability in a non-performing or an underperforming school. So I want to be really clear and educate the community at large here that our methods of moving forward with this work around potential school consolidation is not to circumvent accountability. We're in a scenario where all of our schools are strong, but some are performing stronger than others. And so taking a look at that, I think, is going to be really, really important in terms of how we look at it. But I just want to educate the public just around our intentions of moving forward. And we're in a position where we should be very proud, but it makes this that much harder. So I appreciate that commentary.
Go ahead, Kevin.
I appreciate Director Duffy's comments. I think they're very well taken, but it spurred another thought, which I hope doesn't go down a wormhole, but how are we defining what is a highly effective school? And the point that I'll draw there is that, again, I'll go shift back to our district priorities, and that I would argue that there are schools that are incredibly highly effective based on their graduation rate, based on the populations and the communities that they serve, and that the more vulnerable communities that have a higher graduation rate of a certain school, to me, signals a incredibly highly effective school, and also allowing students to graduate with options. So I think we need to be a little bit more mindful about what we're defining as a highly effective school as we're considering this question about, how do we expand programming across the district where there are wait lists. Is that the only metric to determine how we're going to guide the steering committee's work in this zone? I think we need to have a better understanding of what it is to be an effective school. And I think one component, just by an example, one component would be a high graduation rate, especially among, students that are in vulnerable populations.
Anyone else? One of the things that I want to jump on that then, Kevin, is it's the graduation, it's the effectiveness of and I think taking into consideration graduating rate it's a good thing, but it's not the only thing, as you're saying. that's definitely something that we need to be looking at. And would there be more kids who would go into that particular program if the building constraint wasn't there? So, so is the rate lower because they just can't have more kids in the program? So I think there are other things to look at as well. So I agree with you that it can't just be, this school is outperforming this school, so we're going to take whatever curriculum this school is using and put it into everything else. Everybody needs a little something different, and that's one of the great things that we do here is we offer so many different things. That said, too, what we could do is, we talked before about with that proximity. When we have a lot of neighborhood schools that are in close proximity, if there's a repurposing that could be done, then looking at that for an expansion of a different, school with different programming that does have a wait list, but making sure that they're not next to each other, particularly because they don't have, at this moment, they don't have busing. It's everybody has to bring their kid themselves. So, to have two schools on the south side or two schools on the north side or east or west that offer the same program, I think we just need to take that into consideration as well. So building constraints and proximity to other. Yes.
I got a follow-up question on that. That's a great point, Madam President. I appreciate that. One question I had, though, is that do we have an inventory or some sort of data point of what the wait lists are for various programs? I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding. That'd be great if we could start there, too, so we could at least see where the choke points are and see maybe where a dearth is of certain needs, because I think that's a good point, is that this isn't just a supply and demand market analysis, but I think using those data points might help inform that discussion more, too. Because and I'll be fully candid, I don't know what that data is and where the greatest needs are.
Yeah, I'm seeing nods of heads that we definitely have that, and that'll be given to the steering committee, I'm assuming day one? Whatever they need. Whenever they ask it, it'll be given to them. So steering committee members, day one? Yes, Scott, go ahead.
On that wait list information, it would be good if you had historical, not just this year, because I think with the instability or the questions about what's going to happen, that may change who's decided they're going to be on that wait list or not. So let's make sure they have that data. I agree with Director Duffy on the assessment of, what's the most effective program, because I think we have some incredibly effective programs here. And what President Draper was saying about the flexibility of these choice-in schools, I think that actually, could be a positive in terms of, hey, if you have a wait list and you're flexible, you don't have to worry about busing or anything like that, you're a great candidate to go into a much bigger building that maybe has to be consolidated with another building. So utilize those kind of strengths and things like that. I think that just will make common sense as the steering committee starts looking at things. So I think we have some flexibility in the system.
So maybe if I were to name that, and tell me if I'm wrong in here, but this may sound a bit strange, but the schools that are in there at the moment may not be the schools that are in there later. So, for instance, if a school that is bursting at the seams could take the place of a larger school building, and they could flip-flop, and that could be something that would work. So that's a possibility. I don't want to put that out there as a criteria, but I think it's definitely something that we are open to. Are there other things?
Sorry, just to follow up on these thoughts, is that one of the questions I was asking about where those thresholds are, as far as a guiding principle is concerned or criteria, is that we look at the programs that have the greatest demand now and juxtapose that with the greatest wait lists. I think that should be a target for how do we expand this, and that furthers, I'm really sorry, excuse me, what you were just saying. So.
Go ahead, Jess.
I think in reading this question over and over again, we get focused on the programming with waitlists, which we absolutely do need to set forth and consider and expand where possible. I think one thing that I don't want to get lost, and I don't think it is amongst us, but I just kind of feel like it's necessary to state, I don't want to lose programming. I don't think we should diminish the amount of programs we offer and the alternative options we offer to kids that help them be successful and graduate and do all the things that they need to do beyond high school. I don't know if that really fits, but just felt like it was a value that needed to be stated.
Okay. Other things on this one? Since we're here, would you like to try and narrow those down to 2 to 3? And then we will come back. I know I keep breaking my promise. I would throw out that the first one that I would like to see is the maximize program continuity K through 12 in terms of location and at each level. I feel like that has incorporated much of the conversation that we just had into a very lovely short phrase.
May I ask the board to consider something? I like the direction we're headed. I have a wondering, and maybe this is too weedy, and if it is, just tell me to kind of come up for air. One of the things that I think we need to think about as a district community is the root cause of a wait list. Sometimes it may be the curricular offering. Sometimes it may be the outcomes that the school has experienced and people want to be a part of that. Some of it may be supply and demand, where you have a limited amount of offerings and it draws a greater demand. Maybe the facility doesn't allow it to grow. And so I'm curious if there's any thoughts that you have around that. Like I'll use an example like where we have schools that have a kind of compacted class size that's below our district average. That comes at a cost, and they can't grow within their current facility as a result of that cost. So the whole utilization piece kind of gets blown out of the water in that space. So maybe that's too weedy, but I'm curious if there's any charge from all of you to kind of better understand where we have wait lists, to understand why and what we can do to sustainably grow. Like if there's anything I've heard loudly from the community over the last 6 months is I don't think people are opposed to growth. They just want it to be sustainable where the program can maintain its integrity. And I appreciate that. So I'm curious what your reaction is. And if that takes us away from the narrowing down, please forgive me.
No, actually, what I am thinking is that we sort of touched upon that on that first question by saying, the optimal understanding that this is not going to be true for all schools and programs. So I don't know how you all feel about that, but to me, if we were, Lauren, can you flip back to the previous slide? I'm sorry, where we had that, those 3 highlighted. So aim for enrollment optimization. And so, maybe on something like that, we can say aim for optimization, and somehow incorporate in consideration of programming, or something to that effect.
You might already have it covered. Sorry. You might already have that covered. And
Okay, yeah.
So
Knowing that this is not fit for all schools to minimize size factor. And maybe we just, knowing that this is not fit for all schools, maybe we parenthesize that and say various programs or alternative programming, so that people understand that this is talking about the alternative programs and not just, well, we want this one to be small, but not that one. Does that work for people? Okay, thank you. And going back to this one, so now, do we have one that is jumping out at people?
I think on the comments that I put up there, the 4th bullet point down can be taken out and just use that, consider curriculum demand instead. That kind of lifts the location element of that as well.
How are people feeling with that, as far having that be our sort of second? Okay. And is there a possible? Sure.
I'm looking at this again, and the do not reduce current program options going through this work, I get that, and I want to validate that too, and that's certainly my instinct too, is to preserve what we have, but I think the whole purpose of this conversation is that we can't afford all the things we want. So we're going to have to make tough choices about, because if we're going to consolidate schools, and we're going to consolidate programs, I mean, something's got to go. And so I don't know if we can preserve that.
I think I would argue that, I'll jump in just a second, but I think what I would argue on that is that it's not, yes, you're right. There are going to have to be things that are gone if schools are consolidated. And I think the point is we want to make sure that we are not eliminating core knowledge in all elementary schools or, IB in all middle
I
schools.
see.
So we just want to make sure that is, that we're not reducing programming as we go through the K through 12 or as we go through, go ahead, Jess.
I mean, to the beginning of our conversation, right, you talked about unifying so we're not unifying all schools to be exactly the same was more my point, right? Making sure that we still have a plethora of options. Yeah.
Okay, I better, now that's helpful. I better understand that point now. Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate that too, Kevin, because I was having it felt a little black and white to me, and now that I understand the discussion, it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah, and I think that falls into the continuity too, which I'm not sure that's, we had at that with maximize program continuity. So we just want to make sure we're not making an offering in one place and not having that elsewhere.
I personally like the 2 bullets under consider curriculum demands, use data about current wait lists to inform recommendations, and work, understand why those exist and how program can be most sustainable. I think it's a fairly loaded task, but I think that's a pretty good charge. I'm not saying that, I know the buzzy word is always driven by data, right? I was an instructor when that came of age too. I think we need to look through that data meaningfully and ask some probing questions around that data point, but I think examining the data is a really good starting point. I mean, that's why we're doing the work that we're doing.
All right, other feelings on that, Jess?
Yes, I agree with that. And I think the one that keeps sticking out to me, which I think could be wrapped into it, is the one right before it actually, right? To figure out what does it mean to be an effective school. And I think there's something in there, like almost like a story to the data, right?
I think that's Connor's point too, a little bit, right? So if there's a reason these families want a certain program, there's a reason they're willing to put an application in and wait to get into those programs. So let's explore that. Let's see what that means. And also, to your point, Superintendent Kingsley, is let's examine the reason why there are choke points, right? Is it space? Is it location? Is it offerings? Is it that the program just needs to be small? I think those are all important questions to ask.
So one thing I want to make sure I say this eloquently, as eloquently as possible. I'd like for us to continue to consider some level of root cause analysis, right? Where the committee explores that. I'm not suggesting specific guardrails, but another area in this community is we're a well-resourced community. And a part of being well-resourced is people have resources to choose where they're sending their children to school. But not everybody has that choice. And when you look at concentrations of poverty across our district boundaries and who really has access to the full breadth of offerings, I think that's something that we should be curious about. Because right now it's choice if you have the means to get there. And I've heard this board and the former board charge us to think differently about that. And some of that resource and where there's concentrations of resource, like heavy resource, can also contribute to where there's wait lists because they can get there and there's a demand. So that's not the only component. Curricular demand, programmatic success and outcomes are all aspects of it, but I am curious, the number of schools where we have wait lists is not what it was 5 to 7 years ago because the enrollment's not there, right? So we're not talking about 54 schools that have these deep wait lists. So where we do, it's contributing to other factors that we should be thinking about thoughtfully. And I don't know if we should spend our time tonight, and we can if you'd like, naming all of those factors, but I'm wondering if a guiding principle is for the steering committee to be curious about exploring those. You've already set a charge around listening to stakeholders that are at the school. I'm wondering if that's a part of that process. I'm not trying to over-engineer this or suggest that it's over-engineered, but knowing that we want to increase access, and that's not just about physical distance, within a system that has a lack of transportation, we may want to think about that differently.
To that end, may I suggest on our first bullet point, we could cut everything out before accessible, or is it really accessible? If we just start with, is it really accessible, and then consider where programs are placed geographically. I think that gets to a lot of what we need to be looking at. And within that, we can consider that curricular demand too. Because then you can say, okay, if that geographic region doesn't have something, what is it that that community might be thinking about or demanding? Or so then if we could combine that with that consider curricular demand, is it really accessible? Is there a curricular demand in that geographical area?
I just have a quick question. For the committee, is it possible to give them the information around schools with wait lists and schools of choice, where they are pulling the majority of their students from?
Yes.
That's possible?
That information's actually already on the website for those who want to dive into it now. The School of Choice
So that's-
pattern data has transfer in, transfer out, and a matrix that shows where kids are coming from at each school. So for folks who want to dive into that, that's available, and we'll also provide that to the committee.
Is that the flow dynamics analysis, or is that
It's
different?
part of the many pieces, yes, that they
Okay.
put together.
And that has the school of choice on there as well?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Again, how are we feeling on this one? Want to move on to the next question, and we'll come back to the bulleted, the highlighted, or
Second.
bolded.
Seconded.
Yeah. Okay. We will move on to the next question. And on this question, how do we ensure that we are using our buildings as efficiently and cost effectively as possible? Here is really where I want to think about that McKinstry report, and where I'd like to see that placed, because that is going to give us the most current information about what have we done recently, what money have we put in, what money needs to be put in, is AC even possible in that building, that level of information. So to me, the McKinstry is probably the most important aspect of this one, but I want to hear what your thoughts are. Yeah, Jess.
I think to the McKinstry point, with some of the updates that some schools need, like there's also a wide range of the cost of even like if we do air conditioning. I think there was one school that was like $11 million, and there were other schools that were 3 or 4. So also considering whether or not it can be updated, and also the cost of what that update would be.
Yeah, Scott, go ahead.
I think one of the big things, and I was happy to hear that on the committee there are people that have background with data analysis and project planning and things like that. I think having an expert that's there at every meeting to, be able to give you the pluses, minuses of some of these major decisions, whether it's somebody from McKinstry or, does PSD have a project planner? Okay. That kind of person, I think, would be good, just to see what's realistic and what the costs are. So immediately you can throw an idea out or keep it in the mix. So that'd be my only input.
I'd like to see some analysis, if possible, as far as a criterion. Again, I'm trying to use data as much as we can to make this an objective process, but using that report, and this is exactly what I was thinking of when they were presenting about the AC, as well as the infrastructure updates, doing some sort of ratio between each school in our district, the amount of money it's going to cost to implement AC, and their enrollment numbers. And I'm not advocating reducing education to a per pupil, metric of it's 10,000 per head, and that's what, but I think that's an important ratio as we consider. If we're considering the cost investment of doing something like Scott's talking about in one particular school, we need to see at least what that delta is. And so if there are schools that would, be on way one end of the spectrum as far as enrollment numbers and costs to do it just for the AC, I think that's a fairly interesting ratio. And then developing some, just like we did with the 60 to 70% range as our first look, or those are the schools that would get first consideration as an idea.
Another thing I might consider, and I don't believe this was in the McKinstry report, but we have certain elementary schools that do have early childhood rooms that have been put into the buildings. So I think that that's an important factor, because a lot of these things that we'll be looking at, and it may be that one school does have early childhood, and we're looking at making the entire school early childhood center. Then we start off with something that's already been done, or something, there's various ways that we could look at that. But I think knowing which buildings have the early childhood already in there, and I would argue any ADA things that would need to be continued or worked on would have to be, and that is in the McKinstry report, the ADA summaries. But I don't believe the early childhood is. Is that correct?
We have information on where early childhood is placed that we can provide to the group.
Yeah, but it's not in the McKinstry report, right? We have it on the maps.
It's not pulled out specifically as a separate category, no.
Okay, all right, thank you. Yeah.
Piggyback on that. I think maybe if we're going to consider early childhood, because hopefully it will increase as we figure that out, maybe also providing information on how many classrooms it could be at some elementary schools. I think some schools have more capacity than others. Whether or not they're using it for early childhood is very different than whether or not we could, because right now we have like one site early childhood. If we do want to consider more in the future, knowing where that is might be helpful.
Go ahead, Connor.
Moving away from air conditioning, I know air conditioning is the hot topic, but other elements of the operational and maintenance costs within the buildings. And I'm not talking about one-off items where we have to redo boilers. There are just some buildings that are so old within the fleet of schools that cost 30 to 40% more to operate. I think that decision criteria needs to be taken into account by the committee. And quite honestly, some of those schools might actually have some sort of air conditioning. And I know we all want air conditioning, but if it is costing the district and that specific school an exorbitant amount of money because the actual building, not the air conditioning, but the building is inefficient. And McKinstry has done some of that work. And to make that building more efficient, that's a capital expense. So we've got to look at it not just from which school can have air conditioning and whatnot. It's that operational maintenance cost. I'm not sure if McKinstry went into it. Jeff, you might know better, but do we have a square footage energy cost per building, something of that element, something that we can normalize the cost per building on energy consumption?
Thanks. They didn't specifically have that, although we do, right? We have an energy utility manager who keeps that data, and we can do the energy use intensity mapping on top of the McKinstry data.
And last but not least, on buildings, just to put it bluntly, there are buildings in the district that should be off the list. And that has to do with ADA, that has to do with legacy fire compliance, that has to do with safety and security. And I'd like to see the committee at least understand where those buildings are at and the challenges and the cost that they would need to bring those kind of up to what we consider is standard compliance.
May I ask a clarifying? I'm so grateful you said that. I just want to restate that back to you to see if the community is tracking. We have some buildings that are below what we would say is our district standard and should be considered to be potentially decommissioned. I know that's a strong word, but I'm curious if that is what you meant and that was your intent.
Correct. It goes back to, you're spot on to answer your question. It goes back to kind of my first statement about the investment efficiency. Some of these schools, the amount of investment that it would take just to kind of get us to where we're acceptable with is so high that it wouldn't be a good investment with district money. And then I definitely want the committee to understand that, you know, there are just some buildings out there that, you know, we really do need to decommission.
Go ahead, Jim.
Something I've been wrestling with that I hope I can get the steering committee to wrestle with is the question of K through 8s. So we have our elementary schools, K through 5, we've got our 6, 7, 8 for our middle schools, and we have some elementaries and some middle schools that are very close to each other. So you could just say, well, we'll just take the elementary, move them into the middle school, touchdown, I closed a school, right? And probably most parents in the area would like that, right? Because it wasn't a huge change to what they had before. So that's the stuff I like about that. But I think there are some subtle issues that I hope that the steering committee will consider in this of, once again, the vibrancy of the school. The 4th grade class didn't get any bigger in that scenario, right? The 8th grade class didn't get any bigger. So as things continue to shrink, as I discussed before, we could still be in a position where the different class sizes are maybe not as vibrant. In that scenario, do you have the right music teachers to teach all the way across the line? Do you have the right art teachers for middle school? Do you have enough people for a band? Do you have a decent sports team? Or, you know, pick your different area. But there's a trade-off there, and I'm actually not quite sure where I wind up on this whole thing, but it is something that I would like the steering committee to really work on and come back with a proposal on that.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. The only other thing I'd like to throw out, is we just want to make sure too that we are looking at buildings that may be locking in a constraining growth because of that. So that, I think we hit upon it in the previous question with programming, but I just want to throw it out there as well that from a building perspective, sometimes a building is keeping a program or from growing too much. So kind of the flip-flop of that. Brian, you had something?
I think that's a great point. I appreciate that. I'd like to go back to Director Brokish's statement and restate that back to you, because as you were articulating what you shared, there's intersectionality with all 3 questions, right? Around how do we expand programming where there's a demand? How do we use our buildings more efficiently and cost effectively? And how do we think about potential consolidation? And so I'm wondering, is that a driver, a process driver to have the committee consider creative grade configurations to achieve the desired outcomes outlined in the various questions? I don't know if that's too specific, but because that's cross-cutting across all of the questions, I wondered if that was an appropriate place, since the board illuminated some of those. And again, that's my term, not the board's, the process drivers that were on the first slide. I just thought that was something to consider.
If grade configurations meant K through 8, yes. Then yes.
Yeah, sorry.
I think I might flip that question and say that our criteria would be not to eliminate that. And so, the steering committee should not be eliminating any possibility of a K through 5, K through 8, K through 12. Look at all grade configurations and see, because we may find that an alternative high school with a K through 8 would actually be the best thing. We don't know. So I feel like flipping that.
That your suggestion is stronger than mine. That's a great suggestion.
Can I say one more thing? I'm curious if we can figure out a way to rank schools, the buildings, not the schools, the actual facilities on some sort of grading scale that use a combination of all these things we're talking about. So the efficiency loss of a school, if it's an F, that gets some sort of score that's informed by the McKinstry report. I'm also thinking about ADA compliance is a big one for me. A lot of our schools aren't. That's a problem. And not to pick on this, but I think people in PCA would agree that that building is not a great one. They have 2 functioning toilets. I don't know if anyone's, I'm sure a lot of people have been in there, but they have 2 functioning toilets. Most of their classes are in modulars, which is fine. I've gone through those myself. And the students yet themselves have built things in that school to make it better, right? So they put their own thumbprint on it, and they're resilient. They're the warriors, you know? I think no one in that school would argue, though, that if they got an upgrade in school, that they would have a problem with that, right? And I don't want to speak for them, but I think there's a way to we can attack some low-hanging fruit here as far as the worst of the worst buildings that would be a great conversation starter. And again, I'm trying to give some guiding principles that are also backed by data so that the steering committee, with all this that we've been talking about tonight, has somewhere to start. So.
Okay. It is time to narrow it down to 3.
And a little bit of what the third from the bottom, understand the cost of bringing buildings up to standard. I think that's what Connor, we could consolidate those 2 points. I think I just repackaged what he said and coined it off as my own, so.
And I think actually we can combine the top one too by using the McKinstry data. And that can just be, using the McKinstry data and other data, rank the efficiency of buildings based on efficiency score.
Kristen, may I say something?
Please, yes.
A notice, I think what you just illuminated is a very strong charge. Noticing when I look at the other bullets, there is a sprinkling of other suggested data points that maybe you want to draw in to that last one. For example,
Early childhood ADA compliance. I think Lauren's filling it in as
square footage, energy cost. There's
yeah.
That could potentially be cascaded there, or scaffolded, excuse me.
Yeah. Go for it.
I think what I start to think about too with this last bullet point now is, are there any schools that are more flexible than others in how they're set up, right?
Can you dive into that? I want to understand what you're saying. I think I'm there, but can you?
I mean, some schools have like really hard walls, whereas others maybe have flexible walls, like what are they called? The accordion walls between, or the partitions, right? So if a school is pretty easily like changed, malleable, for lack of a better word, maybe like that would be considered differently than a school that would require substantial construction just to change it into something else.
I'm almost wondering, and if the bottom 2 bullets consider all creative grade configurations, and then the one that Lauren was just working on is using McKinstry and other data, that seems to incorporate nearly everything that we've put up there. Am I correct? Yeah. Sorry, right in that zone where the reading glasses don't help and can't see that far. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
So, yes, and I have a wondering around what Director Duffy suggested about taking a hard look at schools that we should consider taking offline. We've heard just in this conversation, I've heard some board members reference the facility integrity and just all around. It's below standard at PCA. I've been consistent talking about that since the fall. I would say our community connections program is another area. So I wonder in those last 2 bullets if you see that captured yet.
I'm not seeing that yet, and I don't, how would directors like to see that added in there? Go ahead, Jess.
I mean, I kind of see it with the whole ranking of buildings. If a building is not fulfilling its basic needs, it would probably be at the very end of the list. But I don't know if that we're explicitly saying what they should do with that information, though.
So again, I think the point I was trying to make was I think that those are starting points, right? So let's examine those buildings first in this discussion, similar to the utilization rate. Let's examine, we're not committing to anything, but let's examine, probe behind one of those reasons, and I think solutions will spring from that. Or I hope solutions will spring from that. Some are evident, right? With PCA, there's some that are just gonna be, again, low-hanging fruit. This is not fit for our students, and our students deserve better than this. And so let's decommission that school. It's gonna cost way too much to repair it, and so that needs to be highlighted as far as a point of entry, so to speak. That's the point I'm making, I think.
Yeah, and I think that, Lauren, what you captured there, I think is very good.
I think we just want to have a little bit of flexibility on determining use, just given some of the other rules that exist beyond the district's control that we need to take into account as we're thinking about how we use our buildings going forward. So I might loosen that language just a little bit.
And I think we can, consider it. I like that. Consider options. The other thing is that I don't know that we want to put that to the steering committee. They don't need to come up with the options. That would be given back to us and to say, we want to decommission this building, and now it's up to you of how to use that, and we can come up with creative solutions on that. But I wouldn't want to put that on the steering committee, because that's yet another thing that.
Can I add?
Yes,
So
please.
I think as we had a shared experience at CASB learning from lessons learned in Jeffco, I think that was a second order change kind of principle to think about the utilization of vacant buildings after this gets taken care of. So I just really want to thank you for naming that.
No, thank you. I think it's important too that we can talk about within the community that when we were talking about decommissioning buildings, that means as schools, as neighborhood schools, or as whatever schools that we end up decommissioning. PCA is not a neighborhood school, but how do we then use the building is a whole nother process. Yeah, that is definitely something that we want to figure out how to do that. There's many possibilities, early childhood centers, health centers, various things that we can talk about, but that is a second order configuration there. Okay. How are you feeling about those three? I got a thumbs up. Thumbs up. Thumbs up. All right, moving on. How do we address declining enrollment on the west side of the district and growing enrollment on the east side of the district? And this is where I just want to reiterate once again that this is a completely blank slate. There are no preconceived notions, no ideas about. I think what we need to let the steering committee know is that we're looking at everything. We are looking at building new, not building new, what the possibilities are of consolidating K-5, K-8, middle school, high schools, K-12, and movement and boundaries. Those things are all on the table. There is nothing that I know things were said previously in the fall, nothing is set in stone at all. And so starting with that blank slate, and I also want to come back to, Scott, I think it was you that had said, we built in Wellington and Timnath, and then we have the declining enrollment. And I just want to let people know that, yes, overall we have declining enrollment, but you'll keep in mind that both in Wellington and in Timnath, we still have expanding enrollment. And so that growth is set to continue, and that is something that we need to make sure that we can address in the district of we're growing and shrinking at the same time, and it's a very difficult thing to reconcile. So with that said, who would like to kick this one off? Jess.
Sorry. I didn't see you. I'm sorry. I think the only thing I really want to say to start us off, though, is if they do come up with something like new buildings, that we need more than just that one plan. because that would require us to pass a Miller bond or something to get the money for it. So that's a nice idea if we can pay for it.
So I would say, like, have an awareness that a new building would require a bond going to the public.
And I would go one step further and say one of the charges for the commission is for the east side schools is to have a contingency plan if a mill levy is not feasible. And the reason for that is because it's almost like looking at two different issues. If you do have a ability to build a K through 8 out there, it gives a lot more flexibility to what's going to happen on that side of town. I think from a director's standpoint, those contingency plans for us should also inform our decision on whether or how we go to the voters. I think that there is, and this is my personal opinion just from living in that area, there is a way for the committee to look at that through rezoning, even potentially decommissioning out there, and utilizing the facilities that are there currently to really high capacity. Is that a lot of moving pieces? Yeah. Kids are going to sit on the bus? Yeah. They've done it in the past. It's an option. And I'd like to have that information out of this exercise to inform us as directors and say, hey, you know, maybe that contingency plan that was, you know, talked about and thought about to inform whether or not we're considering and going to the voters.
Great, thank you, Connor.
Can I ask
Kevin?
a clarifying question on that, Connor? If I understand you correctly, are you suggesting then that building a new school, I'm just going to put it in layman's terms as best I can, building a new school should be, as a guiding principle, should be the last measure before all others are exhausted? Is that a correct summary of what you're saying? I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm just trying to understand.
I wouldn't say it's the last measure, but I don't think it just, and this is my opinion, I wouldn't want to see the committee not investigate the other options in there just because they say, well, we're going to get a new K through 8. Right? If we get a new K through 8, it changes kind of your whole decision criteria on what you do with rezoning and stuff like that. So I'd like to see them investigate it. I don't think that it, to answer your question directly, I don't think that it is a given that we have to have that school there. Now, whether or not that's 1 or 2 or 3, I'd like the committee to kind of look into that more than just kind of me giving my opinion on it.
I share that view. I just don't know what the steering committee is going to do with it. I mean, the drastic approach would be you're not to consider building a new school unless we've exhausted 2 or 3 other solutions. And then if those solutions are simply untenable by the other guiding principles that we've just articulated, then we can explore that. My opinion, for what that's worth too, is that I agree with that, but I would go one step further and say I would take that off the table for the steering committee, at least for consolidation work. Because I think there are 2 separate, 2 complicated issues, and then if the recommendation is to build a school in Timoth but also consolidate 15 other schools or whatever it is, then there's political problems involved with that too, with representation of those schools that are being consolidated, being the most affected, being the majority of the schools that are going to be voting in November. So I think that creates a lot more problems. I personally would like to see them separate and distinct, but I could be talked off that ledge.
I'm kind of with you, Kevin. I really like the idea of them being separate and distinct, and charging the steering committee with coming up with a solution that would use the underutilized schools that there are on the west side of Fort Collins. I mean, we've got a number of schools that are not fully utilized there.
And that's the point too. To elaborate just one more point is that it's almost hubris to think that we'll just fix this temporary problem again with a permanent solution of a school that may not have the same demand in population and growth, et cetera, 10, 15 years, then we've just done the exact same thing, and then the board 15 years from now is going to inherit our exact problem. So that's sort of the big picture thinking that I'm thinking about that, so.
Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, and I think we're kind of alluding to this, but the boundary discussion, I think, needs to be a big part of this, is, utilize those existing buildings on the west side, maybe open up the boundaries more to the east to bring in those students to fill up those schools. That would be the easiest economically to do. I think there's a lot of social issues. I remember there was talk about that when my kids were in school, and they freaked out. We're going to split friend groups and all that sort of thing, but I think that's a viable part of the conversation we definitely need to have.
The one thing that I would say on that, and Dave, I have a kind of a question for you on that. Any potential replacement of bonds that we are rolling off of, would those, if we were to go to the voters and just replace at the same level that we are at now, are those funds in there sufficient for a new K-8-12 school in Timnath? Was that kind of the thinking on it, or
I don't know that I'd be able to answer that on the fly here without some data to look at, just to be honest.
So are you saying that, like, you just extend one that's about to expire? Like, is that, I mean, that's a decent idea.
That gets more into kind of into the finances, and instead of long-range planning. I can agree. We can take the potential of building a new school off the table for the long-range planning committee. I think it's better for them to utilize their time exploring options with the current facilities in place.
I would say, and forgive me for interrupting, I would say that knowing that a new school, even if we had the money right now and ready to go, you're talking about 5 to 6 years minimum before that school is ready to go, right? Between, roughly. So we'll say 4 years. At minimum, if we had all of the money today, it still doesn't help us with the next 4 years. So what I'd like to say is that we're not taking it off the table, but we're saying, given the fact that we know that this will not help the solution within the next 4 to 5 years, let's focus on the next 4 to 5 years. And the long-range planning could be that, as we're seeing in the numbers in 2 years, it's still growing exponentially in Timnath, that, okay, now we're going to put that back on the table and talk about doing that on the sooner side rather than the later. But I don't think removing it completely is necessarily the way to go. And Jal, push back on me if you don't agree on this. But I feel like that is something that we need to let people understand, that is not going to solve the next 4 years, regardless of whether we do it or not.
The only pushback that I have on that is I wouldn't want to see the committee utilize precious time investigating kind of, okay, well, what do we do with the boundaries if we have this or if we don't have this? So when I say off the table, use that, the maybe potentially 5 years out, just to have them cognizant that that's a potential there. But focus, if we're answering this question, focus their time on what we do with the current infrastructure that's there.
I have a question. Jeff, do you know off the top of your head, I feel like I know this number, and it could be wrong, so I don't want to be wrong. Do you know off the top of your head how much the Timnath middle high cost from start to finish? What that? If this is a Dave question, I can ask him too. I'm sorry.
Dave might know as well,
almost,
but in the neighborhood of
130
130 million.
I'm sorry?
130 million in that neighborhood. 134, I think, is the number that for the Timnath school. It was slightly less for
That's
Wellington,
correct, and
just based on
because the
construction
Timnath school
costs.
had the athletic complex
Yes.
on it, and it was a little bit higher, yeah.
Okay. I thought it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 million, so I'm glad I didn't say that and go
Yeah.
with that assumption, but I appreciate that.
And,
Go ahead,
and
Jeff.
even if I had the 130 million, it is not obvious that that's the next place that I would put that money. I mean, we've talked about so many needs in the facilities and so many, we heard a lot about air conditioning and on and on and on. We've got a lot of problems as a district, financial problems, and we just need to be very careful with our dollars.
Yeah, I would agree with that. $1 billion worth of needs and even 130 million is a drop in the bucket. So,
But I like your point. I don't like not having people give me the ability to give a recommendation. If that's the recommendation, then that's the recommendation, and I presume they've exhausted all their options. I would like to see it either last case option or some sort of prioritization that, look, put your heads together and we've got to figure out to do the important work in Timoth that we're also doing in the southwest part of town. That's kind of that's where I'm gravitating towards.
yeah, I agree with that. And go ahead, Jess.
I mean, I think it kind of depends on also what you mean by long range, right? I mean, we don't just need a solution for 5 years from now. We need a solution much sooner. And if we just punt and decide, well, we're going to build a new, at whatever it happened to be, we aren't going to have that for a while. So we're still going to need a solution. And so I think I do kind of want to take it off the table because they're making recommendations for a year and a half from now. They're not necessarily even making recommendations for the 5-year plan. Like if we want a robust plan, then it's the immediate, what does it address our needs for right now?
So if I could maybe focus it in and say, given the fact that it will be at minimum 4 years to build a building once we won an election to get the money and to build, that is too far outside of this scope. And so we want you to focus on the next 1 to 5 years. And we will come back to the decision later.
I think that level of granularity and clarity will be well received. There may be supporters of building, but it would require 2 contingency plans of boundary changes, short-term and long-term, because the building of a new, whether it's K-8 or 2 separate schools, whatever the scenario might be, will have a ripple effect on every boundary in the system, and having them navigate both of those scenarios with the urgency and the time sensitivity here, I believe, and I'm speaking for myself, that would be really well received.
And one more thing to pile on, I'm not wild about the idea of one of the recommendations that we're going to be asked to vote upon in a few months' time is what I call a condition precedent in the legal world. One thing has to happen before it actually goes into place. And this goes to your point, Jess, is that if we're talking about a recommendation that I'm going to vote on that's contingent upon passage of a political measure or ballot measure the following year, and if it fails, we have no solution. I can't vote for that in good conscience. That doesn't address the problem. It doesn't address the urgency of where we're at. So I've got to.
Kind of
Yeah, go ahead.
quickly moving off of the potential of a new school, for the existing infrastructure that is there, in regards to redrawing boundaries, one area that I think the commission needs to look into, and this goes into the question above as well, is the facilities out there are obviously different age, different, state of disrepair. I mean, we have a $130 million beautiful new high school out there, and right down the street we have the oldest district in the school. So for the committee to look into not only past boundaries where we've bussed kids before, I think that's very informative. I'd like to see some of that in conjunction with the flip side to what Director Brokich was saying, is K through maybe 7 or K through 6 in the elementary schools. The current infrastructure that there may be, and I'm not sure, there may be a possibility to hold back some of those students to make sure that we kind of keep all the friends together, but also make sure that we don't have a $130 million high school that is packed to the gills. Some of the schools, some of the infrastructure out there, most likely could handle it. I'd like to see the committee at least think about that in one of their scenarios. It may be, no, we can't do it, that's fine, but I think it's one option that should be in the toolbox.
Yeah, I think Lauren captured that well in the last bullet point there. Consider all creative grade configurations, not to exclude K through 6 or K through 8 school models, to address enrollment on the east side of the district.
It's
Yes.
something we already highlighted in a previous slide, and it became the highlighted one. Okay.
This one's a little bit more specific in terms of geography, but
Yeah.
I think the principle's the same. Where it lives, I think it's cross-cutting. As I was just in the first slide, when we were setting context around how we want to approach this, the steering committee to approach this from a process standpoint, I see that principle as kind of a drive for the overarching process in its entirety. It's for your consideration.
So I like that in there. I would not suggest that we highlight that as one of our 3, only because it has been highlighted previously. Yeah, so you can, yeah. So, given all of that, we're going to go ahead and highlight your 3. Go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, no, sorry.
Oh, you were saying yes, you want to do that. I thought
Put me
Kevin
on
had
the
it all
spot.
figured
It's
out.
just random.
Does anybody want to start?
I think something in those middle 3, really, because the other ones are the first one feels encapsulated in those, and the last one was encapsulated in previous slides.
That was quick and easy. I like it. That's a beautiful thing. All right. For the sake of clarity here, can we go back to the first? You're so amazing. Thank you so much, Lauren. No, it's okay. So for the 4 questions that we had, we have, as our guiding principles, start discussion around consolidation with schools that have utilizations around 60 to 70%. Aim for enrollment optimization. On average, that is approximately 400 students in elementary and 700 students in middle, knowing that this does not fit for all school programs to minimize the size factor. Ensure access, physical access, proximity to other schools, ADA access. Is it really accessible? Is there a curricular demand in that geographical area? Consider where programs are placed geographically. Maximize program continuity, K through 12, in terms of location and at each level. Consider curricular demand. Use data about current waitlists to inform recommendations and work to understand why those exist and how a program can be most sustainable.
Can I go back? I'm sorry.
Please.
Previous bullet, is it really accessible? Does that mean, is it really accessible to all students? Was that the import of that? Okay, do you care, can I add that just so it's clarifying? Because I want the steering committee to understand what we mean.
Okay, so we did consider curricular demand. Use data about current waitlists to inform recommendations and work to understand why those exist and how a program can be more sustainable. Consider all creative grade configurations, not to exclude K through 6, K through 8 school models, and address access to programming, building efficiency, and to address enrollment on the east side of the district. Use McKinstry and other data ranking buildings based on efficiency score, so square footage, energy cost, ADA compliance, overall condition of and operations maintenance needs, cost of air conditioning, early childhood flexibility, and space inside building. Examine buildings that rank lowest and evaluate why they rank as such. Focus time, let's see, what is that one?
Focus time on how existing schools, particularly the west side of the district, can be utilized in such a manner as they could fully enrolled as possible. Focus on low boundary modifications could address growing enrollment on the east side of the district. And focus on changes impacting the next 1 to 5 years. Building new facilities will take time and require passage of a ballot measure, which is outside the scope of this committee. Yes, Scott.
I should have jumped in earlier, but just a little subtle change to the one about using data about current wait list, current and previous wait lists, because of that potential weirdness this 1 year.
Thank you, yes.
Okay.
Other modifications?
Can I ask leadership if they can weigh in if there's anything that we've overlooked or haven't thought about or considered? I know it's late and we got exec session still, but this may be our one crack at this to get these, so I'd really like some feedback from the experts in the room. If you're willing to give it. Anything we didn't consider, could I ask it that way?
Appreciate the ask. Team, I'd like to invite you, if you have anything to offer, please take advantage of the invitation.
You're not going to hurt my feelings.
I'll take a risk and jump in here.
Thank you,
So,
Tracy.
I would say the wait list conversation, and to Brian's point about the root causes, there is so much more to consider about the wait list, and I would use that data very cautiously. The reasons people are making the choices that they do within school of choice aren't necessarily for programming. Sometimes it's for family convenience. That school's close to my work. So there's so much other data behind the wait list number that don't necessarily attribute that to program only. There's a lot more behind that number than what you see beyond a program demand. So I would suggest that you look at that very cautiously.
I appreciate that. And also with siblings too, right? So siblings make choice into a school because their older sibling does, and transportation is, inherent, so they're not dividing and conquering. Thank you.
Go ahead, Dwayne.
Thanks. I've just got one thing I was dying to add earlier. When you all were speaking to the effectiveness, like programming effectiveness, that is such a truly challenging thing to isolate in a meaningful way. Even when you think of something as simple as student achievement or student growth, you have to be very, very careful, obviously, because a lot of that can be driven by the school's student characteristics, frankly, and the populations being served, and there's a lot of factors that researchers would take into consideration in some statistical modeling to get down to a defensible metric that truly is getting at the effectiveness of the school, not just being driven by demographics. So if you go down that road, truthfully, thinking about effectiveness, I'm just cautioning the group to think very carefully about that. And that's beyond just there's different metrics like graduation rate or achievement, and that's also true. So, but I love that you were all talking about that. It's complex work.
Dwayne, I feel like you said more eloquently the point I was trying to make earlier.
Oh, good.
I'm just,
Thank
you're
you.
a better wordsmith with that, but I appreciate that comment.
Thanks.
And I think having you at the table for the discussion for the steering committee about these kinds of things and what does effectiveness actually mean and how do we look at that and what are the reasonings behind some of the choices that are made. Yes, some of them are about program, but some of them are about convenience. Some of them are about anything that could be happening in the world. So I think if we can have those caveats in this, presented to the steering committee while this is being discussed as well, would be great.
One more. The class size conversation. So going back to Dave's discussion about the group that landed on that recommendation, it was using an average class size of approximately 25 students at the elementary level. I was part of that group who landed on that. So that was allowing some flexibility to have a smaller class size at the K1 and 2, potentially having a little bit above 25 at 3, 4, 5. So, but 25 was that base number. So in terms of like the 400 being a pretty sound number that doesn't dramatically increase class sizes, I think that's an important factor to consider, that is sound, and I would affirm that process that was used.
Thank you for that, Tracy. And that's another ask I would have, is that for the committee to hear that, the history of that, who created that, who came up with the number. Because I think it's really important for people to understand that that was not a random pick by us to say, 25 is good. It's a nice round number. That this was actually determined by people who are in the school buildings with the students and saying, this is the number. So I think a lot of these things, if we can talk about the history, talk about the has made the decisions and come up with these in the past, it'll help guide that steering committee and get them off to a great start. Anything else? Brian?
This is more wordsmithing than anything else. There was a bullet that talked about rank the lowest, and I would invite us to consider naming the lowest on what. I think that's an important point. I think the intent was regarding the quality and the current state of the facility. Yeah, I don't know the right term, but I just want to name that. I think it should be named. There was a second bullet that talks about ensuring access, and I think ensuring is hard and access is relative, and I'm wondering if it's maximize is more appropriate than ensure, knowing that we don't have ensured access today. Is that okay? Can I move on to another one? The last bullet, because of the conversation that we had regarding potentially taking off, I think what you had collectively charged is focus on boundary changes. I was wondering if the last bullet is even necessary. I'm not sure. I want to invite you to take a look at it.
I see where you're going. Can we consolidate maybe the bullet just above, focus on how boundary modifications could address growing enrollment on the east side of the district now or in the next 1 to 5 years, thereby obviating the need perhaps of a new build?
I love where you're headed. I actually think that there's some intersectionality. I don't want to make it too wordy, but the second and third to last bullets have interdependencies too. Again, I don't know if that makes it one and makes it more complicated, but
We don't have to have 3.
yeah, I like where you're going. The spirit of my conversation was to potentially consolidate a little bit. I have one last piece. There was a bullet that talked about, is it really accessible? I think we should be specific about what it is. And I wonder if we should think about, are all academic programs? I'm curious what you thought it was, just to contextualize it for the group.
Yeah, for me, it was all academic programs, because we are talking about the curricular demand that is in all geographical areas. So is it, am I choosing not to go to a particular program because it's too far away? Yeah.
Thanks for your consideration.
Yeah.
Brian, could I add a piece? It's kind of piggybacking off of what you addressed, was that there was a sentence around ranking and be super clear. So I also would like to point out that almost all the other bullet language is ranges and allows for breadth and flexibility. My worry is anytime we say rank, really doesn't matter what we're ranking, we tend to fall to that as our mode of how to decide the next decision. So I would just caution and just ask to maybe relook at that bullet. There's so much in those parentheses that people could add to that or take away from that, and it may change the meaning of what you are looking for. So just to add a little more context of where we might see some concerns and issues arise where we might be able to avoid it if we're explicitly clear on what we're looking for from that bullet.
I'm sorry, can I ask for a recommendation then? Because I think I know where you're headed, but would it be appropriate then to rephrase it to say something like prioritize for consideration those schools that X, Y, Z? Is that what you're, or I don't want to just to wordsmith it, but
Correct, and I wasn't even thinking of that. What I think where you're heading is, what is our intended outcome from that piece, right? And so, yes, let me just stop there. And I would say, yes, that type of an example I think would help. As soon as we rank and create laundry lists, it might detract us from the purpose of that bullet. So just something to think about.
I don't have a wordsmith for it, but the way this kind of comes to mind is, when we're talking about schools in general and their academic achievement, we talk about like wanting to have, there's a minimum bar that we say every kid has access to. Is that maybe something we also think about with buildings? Like, you know, what's our acceptable ADA compliance? What is our acceptable efficiency? What is our acceptable, like, what do we have to offer for, what's a standard? Thank you, threshold.
I like positively framing it in order, so ranking this to set some thresholds for consideration. I don't know if that's a better way of saying it, but you get the point, yeah.
Jeff, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have any reaction or thoughts to, because I know you have experiences in other systems where system standards are established. I mean, that certainly could create a pathway in the event that we were to achieve a future ballot measure around how to prioritize that and leverage the McKinstry data that we have. But did you have any reaction to the suggestion around using these data points to identify a standard, knowing the current state with $1 billion in need? I'm just curious how that may play out.
Thanks. It's not so much the need for a standard. I would like to see us have, you know, we need to take the McKinstry data and turn it into a plan of action. Right? There's only so much we can do, and there's a prioritization scheme within it that we need to make our own. The one piece that I would like to add about decommissioning buildings is that unless you plan on disposing of the asset altogether, the carrying cost, that is the cost of ownership, you continue to have to heat and dehumidify and cool and, you know, and clean that building, and continue to be responsible for it on insurance and everything else as well. So we want to be careful about, you know, that cost. And the other piece about facilities I would add, not to go back, but is that the cost to, say, add early childhood classrooms or these kind of things are not necessarily substantial in the context of the kind of changes that we're looking at making. So as we seek prioritization of these changes, some of those things are things we would want to keep in mind.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. So we've changed that to using McKinstry and other data, set a standard floor of excellence for all buildings in PSD. And then in parentheses, for example, efficiency score, square footage, energy cost, ADA compliance, so forth.
Do we have current appraisals of every single piece of PSD property there is? That sounds like a fun undertaking, but you might see where I'm going with that.
I do believe on the insurance side, our risk manager has some idea of what the buildings are worth. I don't have that data in my department, but I do think that exists over there.
I just don't, back to our point, we have a tension of not wanting to do too much or charge the steering committee with then figuring out what the use is going to be. But word is going to get out pretty quickly that once the recommendation is what it is to decommission certain buildings, that there's going to be people that are very interested in acquiring that asset. So it might not hurt to have a fair market value or appraisal for those ahead of schedule that we can live with before it becomes a race to the bottom of, well, it's going to cost this to carry on their books, so we're going to do them a favor of offering them 30% less than what, and that becomes the fair market value. That's my concern. But I don't want the steering committee to have to figure out what to do with the building, but I think that's a really good point, is to figuring out what that carrying cost might be in that conversation. Not to add another factor to this, but it's worth exploring.
And when I said we have that data, I don't know that they're formal appraisals that have been done. They're assessments probably of the value of the building.
I guess I'd offer a word of caution there. I've done similar work with other government agencies. What we might believe, what you might believe, what seems like the value of an asset in a moment like this is frequently not the value of the asset in the market, and becomes a one-time distraction from the larger work. So I liked very much hearing you say, let's not burden the committee with that consideration. Their recommendation is to say, hey, with the facilities we have, let's use these like this. And that leaves on the table the work of someone else to say what to do next, because that gets very distracting very quickly, and their sadness sometimes lies.
Well said, Bud. Thank you. All right, so are we feeling okay with these guiding principles? Yeah. How's everybody here feeling on that?
Best laid plans.
So, there we go.
So before we move off of this item, we just wanted to talk a little bit about next steps and timelines so that we're all on the same page as to where we go from here. So some of this is a little bit retroactive. We selected the committee, we've communicated about that, and we've had this discussion this evening. The steering committee will begin meeting on February 2nd and 3rd. They have two essentially full-day meetings on those days. The board will be asked to take action to collectively approve the guiding principles that you all just composed at your next board meeting so that we solidify those, but we'll be sharing those guiding principles with the community tomorrow and with the steering committee as well. And Madeline will speak about communications here in a moment. We will also have the steering committee come to the board to present where they are in their work on March 19th at your work session. April 23rd at your work session. We anticipate that they would be bringing you all a recommendation on May 28th, with the board taking action on June 13th in either direction based on the scenarios that they present. And I'll ask Madeline to just provide an update on communication plans.
As far as next steps for communications, our plan is to put together a communication to go out to the entire PSD community tomorrow afternoon that would be able to highlight some of the major headlines out of this presentation, right? The delineation of roles we think is important for people to understand that the committee is leading this work. And that we are incredibly thankful for their time and their dedication and what's ahead, and that the board is ultimately the decision maker in this, and that that'll be forthcoming. We also want to remind folks about the opportunity to provide feedback, again, concerns, thoughts about unintended consequences, values in those listening sessions. And then we also want to provide a high-level overview around the guiding principles, because as you all know and have gotten questions around, and many of us have, our community rightfully wants to know how their work is being guided and the parameters that have been set forth. So we're going to report out on that. And then to Director Brokish's question or point earlier, as with all board meetings, we record this, but we will clip this entire presentation and discussion for our community and then link that in the email so that those who would like to be able to take part in either some or all of this can. And then the final point is, as the Facilities Planning Steering Committee moves through its work, our plan is to provide the community an update via email and on the Long Range Planning web page after each of its meetings. So Lauren and I will be working with the facilitator for the Institute for a Built Environment to work with members of the committee to determine how that works exactly, but thinking about providing a high-level summary of where their work is at as they go in a communication to the community. And then be able to package that with things like future episodes of Understanding PSD and some of these other resources that we are providing publicly on the Long Range Planning web section. And then any of the materials that we've referenced this evening, as you heard from Lauren earlier, and some of your good questions around different data sets, again, are available on that Long Range Planning web section. Names of the committee members are there, dates for the listening sessions, so that if you would like to plan to attend in the future. Folks can plan ahead for multiple weeks and months in advance to make sure that they can be there. And then if different opportunities are added or things change, we will be changing that web section as we go. So it is very much a living, breathing reflection of this work in the spirit of transparency and consistent communication.
Okay, with that, we'll be moving into executive session, but I do want to take a moment just to thank everybody who is still sitting here at 10:05 p.m. I can't believe you're still here. My watch has told me to go to bed, so I can't imagine what you're all with kids in the district, you know. So thank you so much for staying, for listening, for sharing your concerns earlier today. To the cabinet, thank you so much for all the prep work that has been done for this, for all the information that you are going to be asked for by the steering committee, all of the prep work that's going to happen with that. Thank you so much for that. And I want to thank the board too. This was I think a very conducive way to get these guiding principles up there. And I want to thank you for all sharing your authentic selves tonight. And I think we came up with some pretty good guiding principles. So